Let's start. Thank you very much for coming. First of all, I know it's very hard to be here at this time, so it is for me. So, I'm here to talk to you about something I call DevQA, and it's related to how development and QA can work together. Well, I already had a presentation yesterday, so I won't repeat myself. It is sad that this contrast doesn't allow you to see the picture, the background, but that picture is taken from the Rock of Gibraltar. So it is actually nice. So I'm Groovy Grails developer since several years ago. I created my own company, and today I work at Odobo as a web architect. We do gaming platform for game developers and casinos. So if you are interested, you can check play.com to take a look at them. So most of you guys are probably already aware of DevOps, right? So this is recurring. This is a buzzword, actually. And the idea of DevOps is how development and QA can collaborate together. So similarly, we have DevQA. Sorry. Because following the same principle, we can find collaboration points between QA and development, because we know that developers write tests, right? We know some of them. And we also have QA teams, usually. So let's see how can we work together. When talking about writing tests in Grails, we know we have several options. So first of all, we have unit tests. We also have integration tests, and finally we have functional tests. So unit tests are usually designed for testing in isolation, so you're testing a class, you're testing methods without any other collaborators. Integration tests are usually designed for when you want to test how things integrate together. And you have functional tests. Functional tests are like black box text test. So you test basically your interface, your UI, from a user point of view. I think it is clear that this is a developer responsibility to write the unit test, probably the integration test as well. But regarding the functional test, we may ask, who should be responsible for writing them, right? So normally, the Grails developer will write the functional test. So we know how to do it. We know that we have Spock and Geb, or Cucumber or whatever. But the problem comes when you have a QA automation engineer. So how many of you guys have a QA team in your company? Raise your hands. QA team. How many of those have both manual and automation QAs? Very few. So the rest of them are only manual QAs, or? I guess so, okay. The people who raised the hand, the second question, so what are the automation QAs testing? Are they testing the UI? Yes, no? APIs? Yes? APIs. So that's the question, right? So we see that there is a little overlapping between them, because we as developers may test what we do, but also QA. So this story is about the problems we found at Odobo and how we solved them. First of all, a disclaimer: one size does not fit all. So this is the story about how we did it, the problems we had, but it's not necessarily meaning that it is a solution for everybody, right? So take the idea as you want and find out how to apply that to your company. The problems we found. First of all, we found that teams were using different frameworks. So developers on one hand were using Selenium IDE plus Grails tests. Do you guys know what Selenium IDE is? For the ones who doesn't, it's basically a tool for, it's a Firefox plugin to create a functional test using Selenium. The difference is that, for instance, if you use Geb, you write your selectors in your code. Using Selenium IDE, you have a browser plugin to figure out your selectors, right? And the tests are run within the Firefox browser. That's what the people were using at the beginning. That in addition with Grails tests and Spock and whatever. On the other hand, we have QA team using WebDriver, plain old Java, Maven, TestNG, stuff like that, right? We saw duplicated efforts. Why? Because the Grails team had the culture of testing everything, right? So it was a good team, not because I was part of it, but because of the rest of the people. So the team was responsible to, most of the times, write not only unit tests, but also integration and or functional tests for every feature that they delivered. And before releasing that to QA, they made sure that every functionality they delivered was tested by a functional test. And then QA came in, and we have in parallel manual QA testing and automation QA testing. And the automation QA testing was basically a duplicative test for that. We didn't have any knowledge sharing, so if I'm testing a page and I need to click a button and I need to find a CSS selector for that button, the developers had to find out first, and then QA after that using different technologies. So we couldn't reuse anything. So what we did, the approach was to define a unified and shared testing framework for development and QA. The solution had to be viable for any kind of web application, because we also found that we needed to scale that solution for testing not only that particular Grails application, but also any other that may come in the future. And the idea was, instead of having the Grails developer testing on one hand and the QAs on the other hand, to add them all in people testing and sharing resources in the same project. So what we did is to create an independent project, because the driver had to be, it's not feasible to give the QA team your Grails application and write the testing in the Grails application. That's the starting point, right? So we need to have something else, because we don't want QAs to have access to our Grails application. So we created a different project using Gradle as build tool, using Groovy, Spock and Geb for testing, and with some custom features that we developed on top of it. Let's go one by one. So it was an independent project. The benefits of that is that it's really easier for non-Grails developers. They just need to have access to the Git repository. And with the Gradle wrapper, they can get started really easy. That also prevents QA to, let's say, making mistakes, right? Because you know, you can find really good QA developers, but at the end of the day, they are not developers most of the time, so they're focused on testing. So I don't think it's a good idea to allow them access to your development application. With this framework, we can write tests for any application, and not only web-based, but also API-based. So we can test UIs, we can test APIs, we can test whatever we want. Disadvantages. The problem we found is the most important one, right? Was how to feed the application with fixture data, and I will explain why. So, the first attempt we tried to do is to use Gorm standalone. This was 1 year ago. Probably today it will work. 1 year ago it didn't. So now Gorm standalone is quite easy to use. And probably as of today, we would have tried to use Gorm in that independent project. But 1.5 years ago, it didn't work. So we realized that we already have Fixture Controller to allow Selenium invocations via HTTP. And we reused that part. I will explain how that works. So this is basically a controller action that is basically creating fixture data, right? So we have also a controller that is exposing this action via HTTP. You can call that via a URL, and the fixture data will be created on your application. We have code that is executing before at the end of those methods that are basically dropping the database and recreating them to make sure that on every invocation you start from a clean start. This is basically fixture data. I don't know if it's clear here. This is Selenium IDE. Still raise your hand if you, right? So nobody likes it. Selenium IDE has some nice features, especially when you have to deal with CSS selectors and you are not a UI expert. So one of the things it has is a way to make requests to a URL. So the first part of our test was to invoke that URL to have the fixture data available. That was in the past. This is what we ended up doing in Geb. This is a Geb test using Spock, as you see. One of the things we did is to create some helper methods to invoke those fixture controllers, because by the time this was changed, this DevQA thing was implemented, the starting point was that we already have, I don't know, dozens of fixture methods. So it will be really hard to recreate them from scratch. We wanted to reuse them. So what we did is basically to create a helper method to invoke our fixture methods. So, as I said, we have a different project with Groovy, Geb, Spock, and everything, and that's disconnected from Grails application. On the other hand, the problem with that approach is that on that project, you are running the test, but to have those fixture methods available, you need to have a running application somewhere, okay? So basically, the requirement is that for having those control methods to be executed, you have to have a running Grails application locally. And the Jenkins setup for that was tricky. So we had two projects. Ideally, you run the Grails application, and when it is up, you launch the test against the application. And finally, you tear down everything at the end. That's tricky to do with Jenkins, because using the Gradle system, you can invoke a shell command, and you can run your Grails application, but there's no way to know when the application is actually running, because the process is blocked by the execution of the Grails application. So There are solutions for that problem, and today, probably the best choice that is available for you is a Gradle plugin who is designed for this kind of problems. That Gradle plugin allows you to launch commands, and you can specify which line tells you that the application is running. So you need to say, the application is running when the output contains Grails started at port 8080 or whatever, right? And then you can move on. That's a Gradle plugin out there. What we did is a different approach. We created a custom script. This is a Grails script. Oops, sorry. Basically, this script, among a lot of different things, you can forget about that. We are using the internal Grails methods available to control where and actually when we can run the application. So the idea is basically depend on package, start the application, right? This is basically here where, depending on the Grails stacks to actually run the application. And when it's ready, your script will continue at this point. And we are forking a Gradle process to run the test against the locally run application. So that's the solution we did. What else? So the language, as I told you, the QA team was using Java, and the decision was obviously to switch into Groovy. The advantages of this is that we already have within the company strong knowledge, especially in the Grails team. We know that Groovy is less verbose than Java, or said in a different way, we're not going to write semicolons. The disadvantage is basically for a QA developer or QA engineer, there is a slight learning curve for them to learn Groovy. But it's nothing they can't do, with enough support. So, because the same way they learned Java in the past, they can learn Groovy with the appropriate support. So, about the testing framework, Spock. It is a beautiful DSL. If you combine it with Geb, it's even better. Especially if you compare with JUnit, So they were using, well, not actually JUnit, but TestNG. So Spock is much better. On the other hand, the people that only have done JUnit or TestNG or the traditional testing frameworks may need to get more time to get used to the BDD style of Spock, right? So they don't understand immediately the difference between the when and then sections of Spock, right? But it's nothing that the time can fix. About Geb. This is awesome DSL. The problems we found basically applying this to everybody was that it's really difficult to try your CSS selectors. Because think about where we were coming from. We were coming from Selenium IDE. In Selenium IDE, you have your application running, and you have a browser plugin, a Firefox plugin, that allows you to test your CSS selector. So you have your page, you type your CSS selector, you click on Find, and the plugin will highlight the element. And if it's not the one you want, you try again and try again and try again. With Geb and this solution is really hard, because you try your selector, and you need to run the complete test phase. So the Grails application needs to be started, your test will execute, and if it's not the correct selector, the test will fail. And you need to repeat the process again and again and again. So you ended up basically running your test in debug mode and using the evaluate button of your IDE to test your selectors, right? So you type there, and if you find results, then it's the correct selector. Who has had in the past these similar problems? Not really. So another problem we found was the IDE support. This is another Geb test. So, well, actually, I think I have some text here. For the ones who doesn't know how Geb works, this is basically the do method is navigating to that particular page. And when that happens, automatically all the variables you type here are content expressions belonging to that page, all right? The problem is that there is no content assist on that, so there's no way to tell the IDE that those are members of that, so there's no, basically, IDE support at all. I don't think this is easily fixable, so it's something that you need to live with. So basically, to develop this test, you need to have open this class to see the content definitions you have available for you, right? So you have to have both files open and to check if this engine variation column, for instance, what type of content is, and to use it. Despite those problems, if we look at the whole solution, I think this is what I call born for developers, right? So, because if you look at this and you compare with a TestNG-based test, this is basically plain English, right? So it's quite readable. It's clear that it's following some steps, and you're clicking somewhere, you're checking that something is displayed and stuff like that, you know. So when basically to convince the QA team to do this, what I did is to create this test on Geb and to compare that with the system one in TestNG, and they said, "Wow, this is really awesome," right? So it is so sexy that I need censorship. Sorry. To make this happen, we also had documentation. Sorry, I have a link. I will show you that later. But we have a documentation in Confluence explaining how to get started, how to run the test, and so on and so forth. What else? We were missing configuration. We wanted something similar to the Grails config.groovy, and what we did is to use the config slarper from Groovy to have per environment configuration variables like we have in Grails. So we can have, for instance, we can have environments, different environments with different URLs or username to access the application, stuff like that. Why? We have two kinds of environments. Because the tests that the developers are writing and the tests that the QA is writing are not strictly the same, always. It depends, right? So basically we have environments with fixture enabled, like localhost, right? Localhost is when you have the application running locally, so the fixtures are enabled there. That means that you can drop your database and recreate it at any time. That's something you can do because this is an application running locally. But we also have live environments like QA or staging that is not that feasible to drop the database because there is more people checking them. And the kind of tests that the QA team is running against QA and staging are more like verification tests. For instance, they're running tests that navigate over the pages and make sure that there are some elements present there or the content that is required is present and stuff like that. So they are not actually testing all the functionality against the QA environment. So to make different or to specify which environment is required for one particular test, we implemented the Spock extension. That's basically an annotation, requires env. So you can specify per specification or per feature method which environment or environments are required to execute that particular method or specification. The idea is that with a command line switch, you can specify which environment are your tests running against. So if I'm running, for instance, against the local host, which is the default one, all the feature methods within the full spec class will execute, but however, none of these, or actually this one, will not be executed, right? So it's filtered by this Spock extension. We also have feature groups. This is actually a part of a feature present in TestNG. They use the feature groups to kind of label different tests, not based on the user stories, but based on business features. So for instance, they want to label some tests to say, all right, those tests belongs to, for instance, operator marketplace. Which means that you may have tests belonging to this feature group spread across different specifications, right? And they have the possibility to specify at command line which feature group they want to execute. And this is also a Spock extension. You can do it also per specification or per feature method. So for instance, if I want to run all the full tests, this will be executed, and all of this will be as well. That's the way we specify using command line switch, which feature methods we want to execute. Any question so far? Nope. Conclusions. We ended up having happier Grails developer because the initial solution, the initial context was to have Selenium IDE. Selenium IDE is nice when you're using CSS selector, but it's not in the rest of the cases. So having a Groovy-based solution is obviously better from a Grails developer's perspective. And we have happier QAs because they are basically learning a lot. They're not feeling alone anymore. And think about the process we are following. So when you're testing something, some page, whatever page, you will create a page content in Geb, and whatever CSS selectors you define there can be reused for the next developer that are writing a test. So little by little, we are capturing all the content through CSS selector, and that's being reused for everybody. We didn't have any more effort duplication because we had everybody working on the same project using the same framework to test. We did effective code reuse through the page content I told you. Also, we are expanding the usages of Groovy through the QA team, because initially this was only implemented in the automation QAs for UI testing, but it is also expanded to the let's say integration QAs that are testing our REST services. But not only that, because we already have Java developers using just Java in different teams, and they are going to be exposed also to use Groovy. And it's just a matter of time. So I started introducing it in one team, and little by little we'll introduce to all the company, hopefully. So that's the current status. As far as today, our current research is to use SQL to automate game testing. How many of you know what SQL is? Nobody? Just one? So SQL is a visual technology to automate testing. The idea behind it is that if you think about the business we have at Odobo, we have games, and we have HTML5 games, which are basically a canvas, right? So all the game, like the one you can see in the background, is basically a whole canvas. So you basically cannot use Selenium to test that, because you could say, for instance, I could click by coordinates, but it's impossible to you to recognize the element you're receiving, right? So you need to understand what's happening in the game. And that is where SQL enters. So in SQL, this is basically the tool. So in SQL, you can grab screenshots, and SQL will know how to interact with those elements. So you don't need to specify selectors, but what you do basically is to specify small screenshots of the UI element you want to click, or you want to find, to inspect, or whatever. That's the current research we are doing. There is a blog post from Thomas Lin, because this can be used from Groovy as well. So you can use it with Spock, and we will integrate it into our framework. So, any questions so far? Thank you.